Hey folks, and welcome back to the Sarcast. Today we're going to be doing a retrospective of Cataclysm, World of Warcraft's third expansion. So we'll go over the new races, the new zones, the 5-mans, the rating, and see how they all shaped up and what I thought of them. The expansion launched in December 2010, and with it brought changes to the old world in terms of questing, quest flow, and as well as old world flying, which had been long asked for after being able to fly in Outland, in Burning Crusade, and then again in Northrend, in Wrath of the Lich King. The old world was actually ironically the last place you could actually fly in. Changes to the quest flow meant that leveling an alt was a lot quicker. Changes to a lore master, for instance, meant that you had to do a certain number of quests in each zone before you were able to get lore master done. Made tracking lore master a lot easier and a lot simpler to actually plan out. With Cataclysm then, there were a lot of the old world zones were changed irrevocably as well, such as the Barrens, which was just completely wrecked, Desolate, which was actually made more verdant and green as a result of the Cataclysm. It also gave Blizzard lore reasons to open up several old zones as well, such as Oldham, which had previously been hidden by a force field, and the Cataclysm obviously then wrecked that, which opened up the zone then for players. Hyjal as well then got opened up as well finally, as well as the likes of Gilneas. The wall there collapsed due to the Cataclysm, which allowed players into the zone, which Blizzard had to do because with old world flying you were going to get in anyway. The expansion introduced two new races to the game, the Worgens and the Goblins. Both starting areas were fairly similar in how they worked. They started you off in one place, took you off to another. The Goblin starting area was dull. It was just bad. It just went on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Started off in Kazan, then went on to one island once you get shipwrecked, then moved you on to another island, and it just seemed to go on forever. Leveling a character normally in the old world will take about 2 hours to get to level 10 to 12. Here you're talking a good 4 hours, just because there's so much back and forth and wasting of time because you're just traversing so much ground to do one quest at a time. The Worgen starting area was better, but only just. It was an interesting story, okay enough, but again there was a lot of traversing areas back and forth for no real reason at all. Both races are actually fairly good once you get them leveled. The Goblins specifically, because they are just so awesome. The Worgens, especially the Worgen Death Knights, are just awesome looking, but actually leveling one through those starting areas is just a chore beyond belief. 5-mans then from the launch were extremely difficult. If you were lucky to get a good group or a group of guildmates to run with you, you were lucky. But if you were unlucky and got a fairly mediocre group at best through pugging it, then you were in for a torrid time. I remember one Dead Mines, which we didn't actually get finished, took 3 hours. And that's fairly rough for a 5-man. I've been in raids and cleared 12 bosses in a raid quicker than that. The next lot of heroics that were released then were the Zul'Man heroics. They were leaning towards the initial 5-mans in terms of difficulty when they first came out. They were fairly difficult as well. Unfortunately, Blizzard did listen to the very vocal minority who were QQing about how Wrath was far too easy and how things were just too easy these days, and wanted the game to be made a lot more difficult. Unfortunately for Blizzard, it backfired and they lost close on 2 million subs as a result of the changes that they made in Cataclysm with regards to difficulty. The last lot of heroics that were released were the Hour of Twilight heroics, the 3 of them, and they were easy. They were even easier than the Wrath 5-mans, and sort of as an apology to the player base. And they gave out 378 epics, which was on a par with the 378s you got in normal tier 12 rating. As for rating itself, the expansion started off very good. Tier 11 was by far the best raid tier of the expansion. Coming off the back of ICC with its 12 bosses, you were faced with another 12 bosses in normal mode and 13 then in heroic. The level of content there was exceptionally good. The fights were varied. The raid tier was split up into 3 different instances, which meant that you could save your progress independently, depending on what raid instance you were actually running that night. And the best of this raid tier was Blackwing Descent, really. It was a winged tier, or winged raid instance, and the bosses are, pretty much most of them actually, were amongst my favourite out of the expansion as a whole. The Omnitrons, or Omnoms as I call them, Loriak, Chimeron, Nefarian gets special mention because it was a fairly epic and very, very good fight. And then finally Cho'Gall in Bastion of Twilight was also a good solid fight, especially for tanks and doing a lot of switching up and taunting off. Tier 12 then was so-so. Severe lack of bosses in this tier. 7 bosses altogether. Favourites were Lysrazor and Balrog, and then of course Ragnaros at the very end, whose heroic version has to be the hardest fight in the game as a whole. And still quite a lot of guilds still have not killed him on heroic mode. Ditto for Sinistra in tier 11. And then we get to tier 13. This is how Blizzard finished off the expansion for raiders. Crap. No bosses worth a mention at all. We went in on our first night and we had 2 groups up. One was going to be pushing progression and the other was fairly relaxed. Both killed the first boss on the first pull, and he didn't get any harder after that. The entire tier as a whole, really, just was not worth mentioning, really. Average bosses, average mechanics, very, very badly tuned for the first half of the raid tier. We got the entire tier cleared in normal mode inside of 2 weeks, and then we were onto the heroic modes. It was just really that bad. The heroic modes, tier 11 was never nerfed and still remains fairly difficult to this day. Tier 12 was nerfed fairly early on, after a couple of months really, and it just became face roll after that. The fights in heroic were actually very good, especially at Lysrazor because it was fairly busy as a fight. Definitely my favourite fight of that entire tier. Tier 13 in heroic wise, some difficult fights, but most of them were fairly easy until you get up to, say, Blackhorn. Hagara was fairly difficult as well, just working out the mechanics for it, but overall tier 13 was completely forgettable. I mean, we managed to keep raiding in tier 10 at the end of Wrath for a full year after the tier's release. We've already stopped raiding in tier 13 and are finding it very difficult to get motivated to raid at all, just because the tier was that short. 8 bosses again. Just the bosses overall were just generally uninteresting as hell. Cataclysm introduced several new features into the game, such as transmogrification and reforging, and of course the dreaded LFR. Transmog is great. It allows you to customize your characters more than you've ever been able to, really. If you had a favourite tier set, or just favourite set of clothes or gear, you could have it permanently, looks wise anyway. Reforging came in very handy because Blizzard liked to mix up their stats combinations throughout the tiers as well, and reforging, which came about fairly early on in the expansion actually, made customizing your stats a lot easier and made hitting your caps and balancing out your character a lot easier, and one of the great features actually introduced in the expansion as a whole. LFR then, what can I say about that? Pretty much like the Mos Eisley Cantina, you will never get a bigger hive of scum and villainy than you will in LFR. This place is basically a breeding ground for trolls. Just people who like to screw up other people's day, ruin other people's enjoyment, pull additional packs of trash that aren't needed and that will just wipe a group, just deliberately rolling on gear that they can't even really use or need, and just full of people that just do not like other people. And honestly, if you get all the LFR users together in one room and just nuke it from orbit, the world would be a better place for it. There were several new zones introduced with Cataclysm. The first one this year was okay, but it wasn't really anything to write home about. Hyjal, from a lore perspective at least, was interesting, but it did go on. Both starting zones really did go on for too long as well. Then you were on to Deep Home, which is where Deathwing had been resting up prior to the expansion. This was actually one of my favourite zones that was introduced with the expansion. It was absolutely gorgeous to look at, as you can see. The stone theme, the rock formations throughout the entire zone were just beautiful. But unfortunately you had to do the zone to get your Thursday rep for your shoulder enchants, which made it a bit of a grind really. Which was unfortunate because the actual zone itself is just great. The penultimate zone then when you were levelling in Cataclysm was Oldham. This was a game of two halves really. The first half was pretty good. In it you were helping out the Ramkahen, the cat people, who you were trying to help reclaim their lost kingdom. Once you had done that then Harrison Jones got into the mix, and from this point onwards it just turned into Oldham the movie. There were just lots and lots of cutscenes, just far too many. The quest flow was constantly interrupted by various cutscenes, but you had to watch them if you wanted to get the lore of the zone and the backstory, which involved Bram Bronzebeard as well towards the end of the zone. So a mixed bag really. Good first half, mediocre second half. Then after that you were on to Twilight Highlands, which was actually fairly good as a zone. It was fairly interesting. Nice lead in and a nice sequential story throughout the zone. After that then you were done levelling and you were into raids if you're a raider, or dailies then if you're not into your raiding. So in conclusion, Wrath was a far better expansion on the whole. The expansion was fairly lame. It was dry, humourless, pretty devoid of interesting content for the most part. Just not really all that interesting, either mechanics wise or lore wise. As a villain for the expansion, Deathwing didn't really work as well as Arthas had previously in Wrath. Whereas Arthas was pretty much omnipresent throughout Wrath, and you constantly run into him in the 5-mans and while you're out questing. Deathwing, when he wasn't torching zones, was pretty much absent for the entire expansion until you got to tier 13. He didn't really make many threats outside of the raid, beyond the actual torching of the zones. Pretty absent really. He didn't really make much of an appearance at all. When you got to the final tier raid, then in tier 13, and you got to fight him, it was fairly much a case of meh, so what. As a main villain, as a poster boy for the expansion, he fairly much failed in my opinion. Especially when you compare him to Arthas, who had been such a strong presence in Wrath. Even Illidan in Burning Crusade was a lot better. He was fairly enigmatic. He showed up only a couple of times, but there it worked. Whereas in Cataclysm, Deathwing's large absence really didn't, and did the expansion a huge disservice. So overall, the expansion, if I was to give it a mark out of 10, it would probably be about a 6. At best. It was okay, some good features such as old world flying, transmog reforging, the lore master and questing changes, some of the raid content, but overall fairly dull and not really one I would recommend Blizzard do again. And here's hoping that Mists is a lot better.